Hello, hello. Thank you everybody for tuning in. We're going to be doing a remote viewing. We also have a remote viewing we have a message from Sally Hemings. I was reluctant to deliver a message from Sally Hemings. I would prefer somebody else to give this message, but so please forgive me if I get some mistakes, make some mistakes. But if I got the message from Sally Hemings, then I feel I'm morally obligated to give it. So I'm going to do my remotes, and then we will be getting a message from Sally Hemings. So for those people who don't know, Sally Hemings was the slave of Thomas Jefferson. So she has a couple things she'd like to say, but I also want to say thank you to everybody who contributed to the stream. I posted a question if people in the African American community, leadership, teachers, academics, etc., or just regular folk that like books, etc., if they could start to create a book list for people who would like to know, particularly white people like myself, if we would like to know more about African American history, culture, etc. And the reason that I did that is, yes, it's true, you can Google it, but there's also a lot of racism when you Google Black Lives Matter. There's also a lot of misinformation. And so the reason that I wanted to post that was I wanted elders in the community to be able to create a list that we can all be proud of. All right, so that was why I put the information out there, and I'm grateful to everybody who has contributed. And it looks like I have a lot of books to read. All right, so now I want to get into the remotes. So the first remote I dated was on June 6th, and it has to do with the feeling of where we are at right now, and that is that it is as if there's kind of an angel of death upon us, in the sense that we will probably, as a nation, we sense that things will never be the same again. This is a rough ride. We're going through this intense transformation that is as the angel of death. But the spiritual lesson here is about bravery and courage, that we have ceded too much territory to the psychopath. That's the spiritual lesson for us as human beings. Now, in ancient times, something I could share as an anthropologist that I always thought was interesting was this idea of exile. Now, in modern times, we don't do that. We don't put people into exile, but we might give people a timeout. And in the olden days, exile often meant death. If somebody was a psychopath, if they were taking food, if they weren't sharing, if they were not a team player because life was brutish and short, they would simply send that troublemaker into exile. And one of two things happened. Either they would not survive, they would reinvent themselves, find another community that would take them in, or they would start a new community. We would either become better, or they would, if they were a sociopath, they would be sent out to die. They would be cast out by the tribe. In today's society, though, we don't do that. We don't cast our psychopaths out. And what I call the lizard people, or the reptilian type person who doesn't seem to have any capacity to love and doesn't seem to have any capacity to have a conscience. And so this is an important time in our nation's history where we have to accept the fact that we have for far too long turned a blind eye to the psychopathy, and in that way we ceded too much territory to the psychopath. And so what happened is that the psychopaths, the greedy people who wanted to get rich, one by one began to steal anything and everything they could and sell it to foreign governments. And what happened eventually is that this crisis has revealed the extent to which we have basically sold out our country. So we now have these private armies like Blackwater that has contracts. They'll work with any country. They're soldiers of fortune. They'll work for Russia. They'll work anywhere that trade needs to go out. It's not a moral decision. It's just trade. So that's basically where Russia's money went. We did a remote a couple of days ago that showed intense poverty was going on with the healthcare system in Russia, that everything was bankrupted, everything was smoke and mirrors. And then there was a crisis that hit like COVID, and it exposed the extent to which Putin and his friends had basically drained the social welfare programs in Russia. And that is what's really going to start to come out in a very short amount of time about just how broke Russia really is and just how much was stolen. So one of the things that's happened with this emergency is that COVID is exposing the lies, because you can't put on the facade when your society is collapsing. The future administration is going to have to address the issue of domestic terrorism. And Wanda Sykes, who I'm a huge fan of, talked about this idea that white society has a problem and that white society has to get some help for themselves as a society. The fact that the dominating or the people that are in control did not adequately take care of the problem of terrorism that we've had since the time of slavery, North and South. And so what should have happened was it should have been dealt with as domestic terrorism, and the flag, the Southern flag, it should have been dealt with as terrorism, and instead, and to allow terrorists to have statues in the South when the South lost and the feds took over is in and of itself insanity. So the main message was that we have to decide as a nation that this is completely unacceptable, that we ceded far too much territory to the psychopath, that these are domestic terrorists, and that they survived in their churches. And this is something that also has to be called out. White churches that have been the haven for discrimination, anti-Semitism, as well as racism against African Americans, etc. So there's a correlation, of course, between the KKK, the people in power, and also certain churches, and it was and that in and of itself is domestic terrorism. So we have a problem in this country with domestic terrorism, and for all intents and purposes, these people who we did not totally deal with at the end of the Civil War basically are still terrorizing the nation. And so that becomes the responsibility of the new administration, that the KKK and the Southern strategy, etc., is domestic terrorism, and that even if it and that certain things have to be defunded, and certain things have to be addressed for what it is, which is domestic terrorism. All right, so that was one of the things that's going to be dealt with the new administration. We have some dark days ahead. Like I said, for the next 2.5 months, it's a feeling of intense vulnerability. Particularly, we're scared about foreign invasion or foreign attack, because the United States is going through such a difficult time. Potential for many lives to be lost. So it's really important for us to take care of each other, like the hero that protected those 70 protesters in his own home. He just did what he had to do. Like, really, that this is the time for all of us to stand together and come together collectively, and to reach out to all communities to stand against this psychopathy, because it's really the time now is about standing your ground, taking back our space. And that was the message of that remote. All right. Now, this was a really interesting remote, and this happened today, and this is documented June 7th, 2020. And this is a remote that is very brief, and it is involving a conversation that is taking place possibly tonight between Donald Trump and his staff and Melania and her son, and this feeling, there is a intense feeling in the room that, I'm sorry, I went in and I did what I did, and sorry for spying, but I guess I'm supposed to know this because you're going to know it. It looks like Melania is terrified. She doesn't feel safe in DC anymore. They're holed up. The crowds are growing around the White House, and she's genuinely becoming terrified for her safety in DC, and so she needs to leave. Now, she certainly doesn't also feel safe having her son in this environment. So it's almost starting to look like the French Revolution, with her, Melania, as, Marie Antoinette with her husband, and the crowds are outside and the barricades, and they don't know if the barricades are going to hold, because they're getting rid of some of the people that were securing their safety. So consequently, what we're seeing right now in the remote in the White House is that he is beginning to genuinely fear for his life, and he's already had to go down into the bunker any time of the day, and it often happens late at night. They have a way of reaching him and informing him about 20 minutes before that he will have to go down. Sorry, but I had permission, so I'm giving the information. So he'll be given a 20-minute warning that he needs to get ready, and then they will take him down to the bunker. This has happened about 2-3 times. So you can imagine the intense fear that's beginning to happen in the White House. And so for this reason, Donald Trump is probably going to leave DC. Now, he's probably thinking he's leaving DC temporarily, and that he'll be back real soon once this whole thing settles. That, I think, remains to be seen. But do not be surprised if in the next couple of days we see Donald Trump and his family leaving DC, if nothing else, because they genuinely fear for their safety. All right, and the next remote we have is a message from Sally Hemings. For those people who don't know, Sally Hemings, as I said, was a slave. She was a slave of Thomas Jefferson. She was also sexually abused repeatedly by Thomas Jefferson. He raped her multiple times, and consequently she gave birth, I believe, to 5 children by this perpetrator, basically, that was holding her hostage. So here is what this person has to say, this message that I got from Sally Hemings. She said, I said a lot of, would you please speak on the issue? Historically, people have wanted to know what it was like for you, how you survived. They've romanticized what was done to you with Jefferson in Paris, like she was having a great time, that she was somehow in on this. And she said, people have to realize that as a black woman in Paris with no money, no assistance, nowhere to go, nowhere to run, she would have been extremely vulnerable. She said that she wishes people could put themselves in the shoes of what it was like to be her, a woman of color, with such a powerful man in control of her. And she said that she was told by him and others multiple times that if she were to leave the boat without an escort, that one of the men on the docks would sell her into a house of prostitution on the docks, and that she would die quickly after, like she wouldn't live long. So she was always told from a very early age that she was lucky. The perpetrator was telling her she was lucky. You're lucky that you live like this. You're lucky that I'm doing this to you, because it could be so much worse for you. So she was so gaslit and abused by what was being done to her that she said many people that went through what she went through became frightened, almost to a point of agoraphobia, where they became frightened of leaving the house, frightened of the wilderness, frightened that they couldn't make it. And she would implore people today to not romanticize what slavery was or what was done to her and her family. It wasn't a romantic story. It was a horrible story of abuse. And that's the story that needs to be told. I asked if she would talk a little bit about what kind of relationship she had with her children, and she said that surprisingly, Jefferson was very involved in the, please correct me if I'm wrong if you're an historian, I'm just going to deliver the information as I received it. If I got something wrong, then I would very much like to be corrected. She said that Jefferson was actually involved in the education of the boys, particularly the two oldest boys, and he hoped that they would receive good training. He wanted them to be educated tradesmen, and he hoped that they would become what she called leads. She called them leads. He wanted them to be lead tradesmen. So the two older boys were very close to Jefferson, and he made sure that trained them up to be literate. I want them to be heads of the company, like managers. I want them to oversee the production lines. I want them to know their numbers. I want them to be able to be highly educated. And so he focused on the two boys to take over certain responsibilities. She said there was a younger boy, his nickname was something like Skippy. She said and then she used some language I don't totally understand. She said that he was skipping away. She said he was always skipping away somewhere. So he would go off, and perhaps this individual may have left or run away at the age of 14. There's something she's telling me about at the age of 14, this boy had run from the house or left the house. And I don't know enough about the children, but there's something here about the younger boy. He didn't want to be there. He wasn't happy. He was rebellious, and he would skip away. He would go to the creek. He would go somewhere else. He would hide. He would disappear, and he took to running away, skipping away. So it's a very powerful message from the energy, that I'm connecting with as Sally Hemings, that we must never romanticize or make it sexy what was done to the victims. But we should tell the truth as it happened, and we must never forget. I want to thank everybody for watching tonight's remotes with blessings and love from Los Angeles, and I will see you next time. Peace out. Be well.